Thank you so much, Nina, for this introduction. I'm really happy and privileged to be here today at this museum, and I saw the exhibit yesterday. I thought it was very powerful, and I hope all of you had a chance to see it. It's an incredible exhibit. I'm here today to talk about the Ukrainian classical piano music, which remains a rather obscure and exotic topic. And first of all, I think we should all ask ourselves a question: why is that? Let's imagine for a moment the map of Europe. And let's touch some of Ukraine's neighbors and see if you can think of at least one big name as a composer, musician from those countries, right? Let's say Poland, one of our big neighbors and allies and friends, Poland. Of course, right away you will say Chopin, right? Yes, when you have Chopin in your team, you don't need anybody else. But there are still more wonderful composers: Szymanowski, Lutosławski, Penderecki. You can name many of them, right? Okay, how about Hungary, another neighbor? You can think of Liszt, right? Very famous composer Liszt, or Bela Bartok, another wonderful Hungarian composer. The Czech Republic. Even if you're not very much interested in classical music, you can hum the opening theme of the New World Symphony by Dvorak, right? How about a little bit more up north, Finland? Who is from Finland? Sibelius, okay, yes, Sibelius, right? I don't know if some of you go to church, you sometimes sing and hear this great hymn of church. Right, sounds familiar. That's from Sibelius's symphonic poem Finlandia, just with added words, and now it's sang in America all over the country as one of the great hymns of the church, right? So what about Ukraine? Again, if you still imagine that map that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Ukraine takes a very big chunk of it. Ukraine actually is much bigger than any of the other countries I mentioned in terms of territory. So what is the big name from Ukraine? Okay, thank you. I hear some Ukrainians here. Great, you know your music history. You got an 8. But not really such a big name, right? It doesn't come to mind like Chopin or Dvorak, right? And why is that? Is it because you know, the millions of people, many generations who lived on this vast territory for hundreds of years were somehow underdeveloped and unable to create anything meaningful, not one tune that you would know, not one name that would pop up in your head? Of course not. That's not. I hope you don't believe that there are some more or less talented nations, right? That's an absurd idea. But to answer this question, I think Luba answered in her presentation partially to this question, and it's a key question to understanding what is happening right now. Right? To answer it in just one sentence is that when all these other nations received their independence after World War I, 100 years ago, Ukraine continued to be colonized for another century, and only now it's fighting for its real independence and sovereignty. And that's the short answer, right? But to give you a longer answer, I want to show you some Ukrainian music that I think you might have not heard before. And if you have, please let me know. I will be very interested in that. But in fact, there is one Ukrainian piece that you all know, 100% for sure. And it's called Shchedryk. Right? Do you know Shchedryk? Yes, you do know Shchedryk, yes. Shchedryk is a very ancient Ukrainian folk song, very simple melody that consists of three notes. And it's about the beginning of the year. It's a celebration of a swallow coming back from south and bringing life back. Beginning of the year, right? In beginning of 20th century, Ukrainian choral composer Mykola Leontovich wrote a choral arrangement of this song. Leontovich was a very prominent choral composer who wrote dozens of his original compositions, mostly vocal operas, choral pieces, as well as arrangements of folk tunes. And that was just one of his arrangements. Very short, it takes less than 2 minutes to listen to it. Back then, just a little trip to the history. We actually did have the independent Ukraine, just how the independent Poland emerged or Czechoslovakia or Hungary or Finland, Ukraine was also independent, but very short-lived. The independent Ukraine immediately found itself at war with several powers, including both red and white Russian armies, who fought each other, but none of them really wanted to allow independent Ukraine to exist. And back then, it was in 1917, Ukraine did not have an army, it was terribly outgunned, and didn't have also support from the West, which we do have now, and I hope we'll continue to have it. And very quickly was defeated by the victorious Bolshevik armies. And imagine that situation. The war is going on, the Bolshevik armies are occupying Ukrainian cities, there is no way to stop them, and what does the government do? And the government does something extraordinary. They decide to form a choir and send it off to the world to sing Ukrainian choral music and to show that there is actually a nation called Ukraine, which is under attack right now. So it was like SOS signal through music. And that choir was formed, it was called Ukrainian Republican Capella, and was in fact sent first to Europe and then over the ocean to North America, including the United States, and gave hundreds and hundreds of concerts with great success. And one of the concerts took place in October 1922 at Carnegie Hall in New York City. And in this concert, they included that Shedrik by Mykola Leontovich. In the audience, there was a choral conductor whose name was Peter Vilhovsky. He was Ukrainian, and he was also worked at the NPR radio station. And he really liked this song. To him, it reminded sound of bells. So he decided to write his own lyrics. And as he was a choral conductor, he gave it to his choir. He made a recording, put it on the radio, and instantly it became a Christmas hit. One of the carols that we can't imagine Christmas. And of course, I'm talking about the Carol of the Bells. So that was the second birth of the song. That is a very inspiring story, right? The rebirth of a song which conquered the world in the end better than any cannon or any weapon. So, you know, this exhibition is dedicated to art created from weapons, right? But here we have a opposite situation when art was a weapon, became a weapon, a very powerful one. But this story has also a very dark side as well. The composer Leontovich, after the defeat of the Ukrainian Republic, he left the capital, Kyiv, and went to countryside to work as a village school teacher. And on one of the nights in December 1921, someone knocked at his door, a stranger, and showed the ID of the Cheka agent. Cheka was a newly formed secret police, newly formed by the Soviet Union, which later transformed into what you know as KGB. So he showed this ID, and it means that you have to comply to whatever the person says because he's been sent by the state. So he requested a room and board for the night. He said, I'm here on a mission, and I need to sleep in your house. So Leontovich let him in, and in the middle of the night, that man walked into composer's room and shot him with a rifle and killed him. Only because that composer worked for the Ukrainian government and helped to create this music that was later sent to the world to represent Ukraine as a propaganda, yes, as a cultural weapon, right? So for those people, he was an enemy and they eliminated him. This is quintessentially what happened to Ukrainian classical music and also to other forms of art, literature, visual art, many wonderful names who were eliminated, if not physically, then their works were eliminated, prohibited, banned, destroyed. There are so many ways, and to give them the credit, the Russians, the Soviets, they are really good at that, and they some of the names were totally lost, and today you're going to hear some of the composers who I, as a professional musician, did not hear over the course of the Ukrainian history of music, Ukrainian piano literature, or any other courses in Ukraine where I studied. And as I say, just imagine an American musician who has doctorate in music performance, and suddenly in the age over 30 years, he discovered, oh, that was George Gershwin. You know? So that does sound ridiculous, but that is a reality of my generation musicians, and not only musicians, but other Ukrainians who suddenly discovered that so much was taken away from us, and so much of our own culture we don't know. And today I wanted to show you works of 5 composers to just show that Ukrainian music exists in a great variety. It's going to be 5 completely different styles, even though they all come from the 20th century. One of the pieces comes from the 21st century, written in 2022 in Kyiv in the midst of the air alerts and missile bombardments. But most of the 20th century, all different styles. And I hope you will see some new names and you'll hear some music that you like, and maybe you'll do some more research about it and find some other music later on. So the very first composer's name is Serhiy Bortkiewicz. He's a Ukrainian romantic composer. Again, even though he lived in the first half of the 20th century, his language is very much like the language of the great romantic composers of the past. Chopin, Schumann, Liszt, all these great romantic composers. He is one of the people I have not heard about when I studied in Ukraine as a pianist. I only discovered him for myself when I was living in New York City in 2014. And the story was that I was looking for a piece about Crimea. You understand, 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, the war started, and I thought, you know, I have to have a piece about Crimea written by a Ukrainian composer that can include in my program to just remind the audience every single time that this is what's happening. So I was looking through different music, and I found this cycle called Crimean Sketches by a composer named Serhiy Bortkiewicz. New name for me, and also with CZ in the end, looks like a Polish last name. So right away I thought, is there another Pole writing about Ukraine? Because I knew there are a cycle of Crimean sonnets by Adam Mickiewicz, a great Polish poet. So you see how it's really strange. I'm a musician, but I know about Polish poet who wrote about Crimea, and I do not know about the Ukrainian composer who wrote about Crimea, right? So I opened the score, and I was looking through the score, and I was just amazed. Right away, even before playing it, I saw Crimea, the place where I went every year with my parents as a child. It's a famous vacation destination for Ukraine. So every summer we would go to the seaside, and there are places that I've spent a lot of time, and I know all the little streets there. And when I was just looking through the score, I could see like myself flying over these pine forests and mountains and the sea, and I thought, this is really the piece that I'm looking for, but who is the composer? And I looked him up, and to my embarrassment, he is from Kharkiv. He was born in Kharkiv, and I'm not going to tell you a lot about his life because I need to move on and start playing already. But if you care to read about his life story, it's really worth the movie, because he was persecuted by 3 different regimes. He was a professor at Berlin Conservatory by the age of 30. He was very successful. He was performing all over Europe. His music was being published, and he was professor of Berlin Conservatory in 1914 when the First War started. And first he was exiled from Germany as a citizen of the enemy Russian Empire. And he came back to Kharkiv, his hometown. Then the Bolsheviks came in 1919, and he had to flee again from them. He was a very wealthy person, and everything he had was taken away, and he was left with $20 in his pocket, and found himself a homeless person in Constantinople. And then he had to flee for the 3rd time because he settled in Berlin, closer to 1930s, and seems like things were going better for him. But then, 1933, Nazis come to power and prohibit all publications of non-Aryan music and all performance of non-Aryan musicians, so he cannot make a living there, so he moves, unfortunately, not too far away, to Vienna. And then Nazis catch up with him a few years after that. And at that point, he's already too tired of fleeing all his life, and he stayed in Vienna and survived the war. And after the war was appointed professor at Viennese Conservatory. His house in Vienna was bombed by the Allied aviation, and a lot of his music was lost forever, including his opera. And after he died, there was Bortkiewicz Friends Society, people who liked his music, who would gather together, play his music, and then they died, and then he was gone. In Ukraine, his name was not mentioned ever. He was completely forgotten. First, he fled from the Soviets. Second, he lived under the Nazi Germany. So double enemy, basically, right? So generation passed, and nobody even remembered that there was a pianist like that, a composer like that. And in Austria, they also didn't care much. They have, I guess, enough of their own composers. But that's just the life story. So he was totally forgotten, and his music was not performed. Some of his music remained in the archives in Leipzig until the fall of the Berlin Wall, because Leipzig was in a Soviet zone, And the Soviet authorities found his music and prohibited, just like the Nazis did before that. So some of his music was only released to the world after 1989. So I want to play for you that same piece that was the first piece when I found Bortkiewicz for myself. It's the first movement from a cycle Crimean sketches, and it calls The Rocks of Uch-Kosh. Thank you so much. So that was the first piece that I seen or heard first in my head, and then when I say tread the music. And I got so excited about this that I ended up recording a whole album of his music. And if you're interested, if you want to hear some more of his music, you can look it up. There are some other recordings now. So this composer now is being recorded and is living some sort of a renaissance, which is wonderful. But the next one has a very similar story and still remains very much underplayed and unknown. Fyodor Akimenko, or Fedor Yakimenko, also born in Kharkiv, 1 year difference between him and Bortkiewicz. They are from the same generation. And very similar story. Also was quite prominent in his younger years. He was professor at the St. Petersburg Imperial Conservatory, and he was the first composition teacher of Igor Stravinsky. Then he moved back during this time of a short-lived Ukrainian Republic. And again, after the Bolsheviks' victory, he has to flee. And if Bortkiewicz went to Germany and then to Austria, Akimenko first went to Prague and then to France. And that's where he died in 1945, in January, so a few months before the defeat of Germany. Died on the streets of Paris from malnutrition and exhaustion. So basically starved to death, I can say. His music is very different from what you just heard. Bortkiewicz is, as I said, very much romantic, very conservative composer of language of the old times. Yakimenko is always trying to find something new, and his style is really unique and doesn't sound like anything else. I would call him a Ukrainian impressionist, but it's a little bit of a broad term. I think there are some other ways to describe it, but very, very unique music. And I want to play two very short pieces. They're called Fantastic Sketches. And his music remains very much under recording. I recorded one of his sonatas. There are recordings of his violin music, and pretty much that's all. Nothing, there are no more recordings. So if you look him up, you'll find very little, but hopefully it will change. So please listen to two fantastic sketches by Theodore Akimenko. Thank you very much. I don't know what you think about this music, but it feels very special to play it in nowadays, you know, and especially here next to that exhibition, because it's so tender and fragile, and it survived attempts to destroy it, you know. They destroyed the author of this music, and then the music remained unknown, forgotten in some dusty archives in France, and some still remains there, but it survived, and it's going to live, and it's going to represent the best of us as the culture and as a whole as a civilization, right? You know, Chopin, maybe not all of you remember who was Russian Tsar at the time, right? Or some other rulers, right? So this really is something that grows through the rubble, right? Cries from the rubble. So it feels very, very special to share it with you. The next composer, Viktor Kosenko, has a different story. He did not leave when the Bolsheviks took over that Ukraine. And basically, there are two options. You can stay and find yourself at the mercy of the regime, like Leontovich, who got shot in his house, right? Or you could leave and then be erased from the memory of your country, right? And end up in oblivion. Kosenko did not leave. He was younger. He was born 1896, so he was a young man when this whole thing was happening. And he lived through the Bolshevik occupation and later through some Stalin's years, but he died really young. He was just a little bit older than I'm right now. And he died of natural causes. He was not persecuted or killed physically, even though if you look at the year of his death, 1938, you might have assumed that, because that's a scary year for everyone in that region, right? 37, 38 are peak of Stalin's repressions, when people were just disappearing and black cars were coming and taking people away, and they were never seen after that. And people lived in fear and waited for that black car to come for them. And that's how Kosenko lived as well. He was quite, he made it well until that point. His music was performed and was published, but then he noticed that from music stores, his music is disappearing. Right? The stores that used to carry his music don't have it anymore. From radio broadcasts, his music has been switched to some other music, right? The broadcasts are being canceled, or same with concert programs, either canceled or switched to some other music. So he was constantly getting more and more worried and expecting that he's got to be next, especially knowing that his friends and colleagues, that's what happens to them all the time, right? So no one came for him, but perhaps because he died before that happened. So I still consider him as a victim of that regime, because living in this kind of fear definitely does not benefit your health, right? So you can just die when you're in your early 40s. And another question is, when you live in this kind of regime, if you're an artist, right, you have, generally you have endless possibilities. You can do whatever art you want. You can follow some other inspirations, or you can create something of your own. There's like thousands and thousands of ways you can go, right? But then what happens when a regime comes and says, okay, now you have 3 ways, right? Now you can write either music that sounds like old, glorious Russian romantic music, Tchaikovsky or Mussorgsky, right? Or you can write some folk music, which is not serious, rather, you know, like to benefit your national republic when we have some event dedicated to this, right, once a year, right? Or you can write something in C major about glorious party and the harvest and the victory of the collective farms, let's say, right? So that's pretty much all the options you have, right? So how do you survive? I imagine if I lived there, I would just quit. I was like, you know, I will go wash floors somewhere. I don't know how to function in this situation. But there were some composers like Kosenko or some others who actually found themselves even in these limitations, right? So the pieces I'm going to play for you are from a cycle called 11 Etudes in the Form of Old Dances. And by old dances, he means Baroque, old European Baroque music. So this you can do. You can take old genres and write something that sounds like that. That's okay. So he takes old Baroque dances. In this case, it's going to be Sarabande, which is a slow Spanish dance, and a Courante, which is a fast French dance. And he writes his music in the style of these Baroque genres, using his language as a neo-romantic composer and heavily with Ukrainian accent. So it creates a very interesting fusion of this Western European Baroque genres written in the modern early 20th century language, plus with a Ukrainian influence. And probably in these pieces, you're going to hear more Ukrainian folk-sounding tunes more than anywhere else in the program. So Sarabande and Courante by Viktor Kosenko. Thank you so much. So far you heard Ukrainian romantic music, Ukrainian so-called impressionistic music. This was neoclassical music. And the next piece was written just 2 years ago in Kyiv by wonderful composer Oleg Bezborodko. It's called Contra, spem, spero, variation on Diabelli's Waltz. So let me just tell you a little bit about this very complicated title. First of all, Anton Diabelli was an Austrian composer from 200 years ago. And he's not really well known for any of his music, but he is more well known for this one particular project. When he wrote to all prominent composers who lived on the territory of the Austrian Empire of the time, and he asked each of these composers to write one variation of his own very simple short waltz. And the idea was to publish this sort of all-stars set of variations to raise money for widows and orphans of the Napoleonic Wars, or very bloody European Napoleonic Wars. So he wrote letters to over 50 composers. 50 composers responded. One of them was Beethoven, who got so excited he wrote not one, but 33 variations on Diabelli's Waltz. And Diabelli had to publish 2 books, Beethoven's 33 variations and 50 variations on all other 50 composers. There are some famous names. Karl Czerny, very young Franz Liszt, who was 12 years old at the time, wrote a variation. But then now, 200 years after that, in Ukraine, a violinist, a friend of mine, her name is Myroslava Kotorovich, she commissioned modern Ukrainian composers to write a variation on the same Diabelli's Waltz, and she called it Project Diabelli Today. And the idea is very similar, to raise money for the orphans and widows of the current war. It was before the full-scale invasion, so it was during the so-called Donbass War, even though, in my opinion, it's all the same one war. And Myroslava, she's a violinist, and she also has her own chamber group, so she commissioned variations for that setting. But Oleg Bezborodko is a wonderful pianist, and he wrote it for her, but also created a piano version of the same piece, which sounds quite different, and I really like it as a separate independent piano piece. Now, the other part of the title, Contra, spem, spero, which is in Latin and means without hope, I hope, is a title of a very famous Ukrainian poem by Lesia Ukrainka, a wonderful Ukrainian poetess. And all Ukrainians learn it at school and learn to recite it by heart. And I still remember I learned it when I was maybe 12 years old. I still can recite the whole thing. In Ukrainian, there is a pretty good English translation. I cannot recite that, but you can look it up if you like. And it's the poem is really an embodiment of resilience. And what Oleg told me when he sent me this piece, he said that in this first year of war, in the midst of those constant bombardments and air alerts and bad news, he still held this very strong faith and feeling that he knows that it's going to be victory and everything is going to be all right in the end. So this irrational faith and irrational feeling that we will prevail. And I hope you can feel this in his music as well. Thank you so much. The last composer is Myroslav Skoryk. He is one of the most well-known modern Ukrainian composers. He passed away 5 years ago in 2020. And he actually was born in Lviv in 1938. And in 1939, the Nazi Germany and Soviet Union divided that part of Europe, and the Soviets annexed the western part of Ukraine, including Lviv. And many of Ukrainian intelligentsia was sent to Siberia right after that. So it was Myroslav Skoryk's family when he was just 1 year old. So he spent his childhood in Gulag, basically. And he came back to Lviv when he was already a teenager and went on to become one of our most famous composers. And I'm going to play two pieces. The first one is called The Melody. And if you ever go to any Ukraine-related music events, you'll hear this piece. This is probably, after our national anthem, the second most popular piece of music. It can be played on any instrument, on a violin. It can be sang like a vocalist without words. And I'm going to play the piano version. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today. The last piece is by the same composer, Myroslav Skoryk, but when you hear it, it's hard to believe that it's written by the same person. It's totally different. It's called Burlesque, and that's something I've played pretty much all my life. A lot of this Ukrainian music really came to my repertoire after 2014, when I started to sort of try to make a statement by playing more of Ukrainian composers. Prior to that, I used to play just standard piano repertoire, and maybe I had the grand total of 3 Ukrainian pieces in my repertoire. So this was one of them. And once I played a recital in Cleveland, and I played a standard program. I played some Beethoven and Chopin, and also this burlesque. And the review came out in the local newspaper where the critic just barely mentioned all the pieces that I played, but then wrote 3 paragraphs about this piece because they loved it so much. And they described it as the brilliant piece of piano madness. So I think it's a pretty accurate description, and see for yourself. Burlesque by Myroslav Skoryk.